This Hangout on Air is live. It's Hangops EU for May 16, 2014. We're going to be talking about Clojure in ops. Clojure is a dialect of Lisp, and it's implemented variously in the JVM, the CLR, and others. And it is becoming increasingly a go-to language in the ops world. We're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about some people who've played with it, and hopefully learn some new things. Let's get going. As always, we'll start with the introductions. My name's Dan, and I'll be just helping the conversation along today. Andre, why don't you say hello?
Yep, morning. I'm Andre. I work at a company called TVBit. We do TV analytics real time. I spend most of my days doing either operations or helping with development. I started doing Clojure, I think, about a year ago. I haven't put it yet in production. It's mostly for personal projects and just playing with it because I wanted to learn Lisp. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it can be used on the ops side as well. Curious?
Yeah. I'm Dave. I work at this for hosting provider in Switzerland. I used to do all development in Clojure at a company. We still most of
Sorry, you're breaking up there.
I am.
Yeah, it sounds like you're speaking through a broken vocoder. I mean, it's interesting if we were doing a session on dubstep. Doing a session on Clojure instead.
Let me see what I can do.
All right. Okay, well, Pierre-Yves takes a look at technology. We'll just sort of frame the conversation a little bit here. As I mentioned in the introduction, Clojure is a dialect of Lisp, and right there and then, a lot of people's eyes just sort of gloss over, right? Oh, it's a Lisp, never mind, I don't want to talk about it. In fact, I was the same way for a long time.
I think everyone, when they start reading Lisp code, they're like, what's with the parentheses?
Right, exactly. How come everything is backwards? Like, wait a minute. Yeah. So that is, it's a barrier. It's a barrier to entry to a certain degree. Whether or not Lisp is, by its own merits, difficult or not is perhaps a debate outside of the scope of what we'll enter into today. But the simple fact of the matter remains is that it can be intimidating, especially to the uninitiated, myself included. That said, it is a language that, or a syntax, a way of writing computer code that is becoming increasingly popular, back from its heydays of the early era up until now, through Clojure and some other avenues as well. Pierre-Yves dropped off again. Oh, poor guy. So Clojure, as we mentioned, runs in the JVM. This is one of, I would say, perhaps the reason that it has gained to the level of popularity that it has, because you have the entire JVM ecosystem available to you. This is a huge benefit. And there's been a number of tools that have been written in Clojure of benefit to ops such as Palette, Riemann, and others. Hopefully, Pierre-Yves can talk a little bit about Clojure, what seems interesting, and whether his microphone is working or not.
Is it?
Nope.
No.
All right. So, Andre, you have some experience with Clojure.
Yeah. So
why don't you talk a little bit about what you've done, what you think about it, problems you've encountered, positives, negatives, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I started with it last summer when I was on like a small sabbatical, and Again, it was, oh my God, parentheses. And I started looking at Kyle's Riemann code. And because I didn't have any functional programming languages already on my belt, it was both learning the Lisp syntax as well as the way of thinking in functional programming, which is completely different to something like Ruby or Python. But I think so. Once you get your environment set up, so I'm a Vim guy. I've always used Vim, and you know there's the always editor war between Emacs and Vim. So when I started setting up Vim for Clojure, I found really quickly that it doesn't work. I've seen some people set it up, like Rob Ashton. He uses Vim like with everything in Clojure, but Vim is quite slow to use in Clojure because you've got the REPL and you're always interacting with the JVM through Vim. And I found that rendering the output of the REPL is quite slow. And just in general, the plugins that are written for Vim are not quite that mature yet. So I gave Emacs a go. And that was the first time when I started using Emacs. And once I got it set up, it's actually a pure joy to write Clojure because the parentheses sort of disappear. It's like once you've done 3 hours of it, you don't see them anymore. You see the code. And it's got so many like plugins that help you. So for example, you've got Paradit, which doesn't let you delete the parentheses unless you've deleted its entire contents. And you've got shortcuts to bring in S expressions just by going Control-right, and it just slurps them in without you having to do anything. So once you get the environment set up, it's definitely quite a simple language. So yeah, I haven't done much of it in terms of real projects. In my old company, I did an upselling component, which took our customers' actions and then tried to figure out what they would be willing to buy next. So like when you go to a checkout, for example, you know they present you, oh, did you forget these? And I built that in Clojure. Our entire stack there was PHP, so it was a bit like PHP, Clojure, sort of weird setup, but it worked. And the interop with Java really helped us because we found so many libraries that we could just use. So that was a really good kickstart. I haven't used Clojure much on server side, so like for like ops tools, and I think at the moment I would find it difficult to do it because like if you think in the Unix way of doing stuff, it's like you have little self-contained tools and then pipe them together to bring up something that you need. It's like if you wait 2 seconds for the JVM to boot up, you can't really pipe stuff. Clojure itself is fast, but you still have the JVM boot up time, which is not the JVM itself, it's Clojure core just loading.
Yeah. Can people hear me now? All right. I guess one of the aspects of Clojure that drew me to it for the DevOps world, since that's what we're talking about today, is the fact that it encourages libraries over frameworks, which makes it very easy for you to build your application, or to build applications around the DevOps libraries that are exposed. The most common example is Palette, which is very different from what Puppet or Chef provide, even though it operates in sort of the same space, because what it gives you is a library, so it's rather easy for you to build tools and applications around this library, which is what we ended up building at the previous company and partly my current company is basically building small REST APIs around Palette to control infrastructure, so you don't end up actually having to start up a Clojure process every time you need to interact with your infrastructure. You get an API and you're able to to integrate with your standard auditing and metric tools.
That's very interesting. Talking about palette there, that you noted that it's a framework, that it's or libraries rather, that the tools still have to be built.
Yeah.
So it's not a quote unquote turnkey solution like
Nope.
Chef or Puppet or Ansible or whatever it purports to be. So two questions there. Question the first is there a complete infrastructure management environment, in the style of Puppet or Chef in the Clojure world? And the second question would be, if not, why? Is it a question of maturity? Is it a question of adoption? Or is it simply a philosophical question that the Clojure community in general would prefer to use Palette? Comments?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a goal of the Palette project to be that, in a way. But by still making it possible to be used as a library. I think people who approach DevOps in the Clojure community, they attack the problem from the developer's angle, whereas many of the tools in automation that are popular today have been built out of the needs of operation people. So there's a bit of a culture shift in how the development of these tools are approached, right? And I think that's one of the maybe one of the key differences. As for why there isn't like a well-known and full-stack framework for infrastructure management in Clojure, I think it's just because there are several popular infrastructure management frameworks, and whatever language these are built in, as long as they're efficient, there's no need for new ones.
Well, that's never stopped anyone before.
I also think. So I also think that the lack of infrastructure automation in Clojure is due to Clojure being first adopted by developers, and only now ops people are sort of getting into it. I was at a workshop on Clojure last year in London, and I was talking to some guys that actually do Clojure full time, and even they haven't heard about Palette because it's not something that they thought to approach in Clojure. They're using Clojure mostly for development and slowly getting into ops with it. But I think when we will see, it's definitely going to come out, like the Chef of Clojure or the Puppet of Clojure.
Yeah, I still think you're not going to see a local agent in Clojure.
No, definitely not. I think what you're going to see is tools being built upon Palette. So like you said, you have REST APIs or just APIs for Palette. You're probably just going to see small self-contained components that build upon Palette, and it's up to you to put them together as you need to.
So the idea of the small self-contained deployments, I think, speaks to a lot of what's current in the DevOps, loosely use this term, world, where instead of trying to manage things in a monolithic fashion, we're trying to be a bit more agile and going these machines are single purpose, and they might not necessarily even be permanent machines. Does this philosophy fit with Palette?
Yeah, it sure does, and there's a good amount of support for Docker and other deployments within Palette as it stands. And there's also so Palette is mostly run by two guys, and they also put out a framework for which resembles Packer to build images to run on containers or VMs, which is called Visage, and is rather equivalent to what Packer gives you.
So for those of us that might not be familiar with Packer or with some of those other terms that were just mentioned, would you be able to speak to that a little further, Kelly?
Yeah, what Packer tries to, and by extension Visage, try to give automation people, whether they be developers or operations, there is a sort of DSL to describe what should be on a machine. It's a building block to get to that self-contained deploy unit. So basically, you go from a DSL, bundle your app and the system environment that goes with it, and it ends up being either a Docker container or a KVM VM, and ready for deployment.
So I'm trying to find Visage now because it sounds quite interesting, but I can't find the link for it. If you can drop it in IRC, that'd be great.
Yeah.
All right, excellent, perfect. Well, that's definitely interesting, and to know that there are already hooks in Palette, which is an established Clojure ecosystem for such a thing, obviously makes it more compelling from an operational perspective. One must, as always with everything, question somewhat the maturity of some of these tools. The fact that it was difficult to find Visage, for example, puts a warning light on. Pierre-Yves also mentioned that I think it was Palette, if I understood correctly, is basically managed by 2 people.
Yeah.
Is that to say that it's 2 primary developers and a large ecosystem with many contributors, or is it really just 2 dudes that if a plane crashed, Palette would cease to exist?
No, there's not. I mean, there's not a huge amount of contributors. There are contributors, but the project definitely is on the size of where Puppet or Chef are today. I don't think Palette is the primary DevOps tool in Clojure today.
Hold on, I got to check Devops.com to figure out what the primary DevOps tool is.
Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. So let's talk about that. What is the primary DevOps tool? You know, we kind of got let's go down and talk about configuration management. But if configuration management isn't the primary DevOps tool, God, I hate saying that. A series of words makes me feel very dirty. But that's not. Take a shower. Oh. But if
infra
that's
code,
not infra code, exactly. If that's not the killer app, quote unquote, for ops people from a Clojure perspective, what is? Could it be Riemann?
I'm a bit biased, so I won't answer that question.
So
Andre, do you have a guess, Andre?
I don't think there are many options. So as you mentioned, you've got Riemann, you've got Palette. The small things are always popping up, but it's not that diverse.
Well, it's definitely Riemann today. The thing is, the Puppet guys are if they finish up moving towards Clojure, it's probably gonna be Puppet eventually.
Definitely. When I saw the announcement from Puppet Labs that they are moving towards Clojure, I was like, yes, this is happening.
Well, this is a relatively, I mean, publicly, I suppose it's relatively new. But my understanding is that they first started experimenting with Clojure in 2012.
I mean, PuppetDB is rather old now.
Yeah. Precisely.
It's a key component of the infrastructure now. So.
Yeah, definitely. So that I think is an excellent vote of confidence in Clojure's direction, where Puppet, which is Puppet Labs, well respected in the space, arguably the configuration management tool, I'm going to get hate mail over that, of choice in a lot of environments, has in fact had a Clojure-based element for years at this point. That means something. That's a relevant data point.
And which solved the real problem for them, right? Because it wouldn't work before. What they had to collect reports was way too slow in the standard architecture, and I don't think it was just a love for the technology, but rather a pain point that they solved.
So I think in like with any, not just Puppet or Riemann or anything, any operations tool that will come out in Clojure, the biggest benefit, well, apart from like the functional style of programming and the benefits you get from that, I think the biggest benefit is going to be its really good threading. It's really good support for parallelizing tasks. So as infrastructure grows, you're going to end up with, instead of having a Puppet agent running on a server, I don't know. So I'm playing a lot with Ansible, and I see a merge between something like Ansible and Puppet happening in the future, where you have like control over here and you distribute out. So that's why I quite like Ansible, and doing that in Clojure would be really simple because of its good parallelism support.
Yeah, I mean the previous company I was at was a developer-heavy company and really small company, and we did all the configuration management with Palette. We built rather elegant tool that was that exposed an API that we could interact with. But I made the choice not to go with Palette at this company because there's still a blocking element to Palette today, is that the crates, which are the equivalent of Puppet component modules, sorry. Well, you still have to write them in Clojure, right? And for people in operations coming from a traditional operational background, that's a major roadblock right now. And there are concepts within Palette that make it a bit. It's not even the easiest Clojure project to get into and write some code for. So that's still one of the not a drawback, but something that doesn't fit everyone's use case in Palette.
That's actually something that we touched on a little bit at the top of the episode, Pierre, when you were fighting with computers, was that given that Clojure is a dialect of Lisp, there is an automatic barrier to entry. Whether that barrier to entry is because Lisp is difficult, or because people think it's difficult and then don't want to get into it, nonetheless, there is a barrier to entry.
Yeah, there is. My take on it is that it's not the look of it that's the problem. It's not because it's a Lisp. It's rather because of the properties of the language and its approach to mutability that forces you to reason differently about state, and it's a tough shift to make. And in addition to that, having an unfamiliar syntax of sorts doesn't help you along the way. But I think the thing that you struggled the most with when starting Clojure are rather the approach to state than the syntax details.
And Emacs.
I did switch to Emacs when I started being a full-time Clojure developer, and quite happy with it now. But apparently, people are really happy with the Vim support now.
So I was saying when we started speaking that when I started doing Clojure, I was just a Vim developer, and that's my favorite editor still. But I had to switch to Emacs because the support in Vim isn't quite mature yet, and it's quite slow and painful to use. But I found switching to Emacs, apart from like the bare claw shortcuts, quite a really nice environment to develop in.
Yeah. I've been enjoying it as well, and it's even more reason not to log into machines and do work on machines and try to have so that you can stay on your own computer with Emacs. So, yeah, it's been good to me that way.
How about, and I think it's worth talking about that a little bit more. If you need a specific environment, need is a strong word. If it's better to have a specific environment in which to develop it, does that not in and of itself constitute somewhat of a barrier to entry? I think I opened Emacs once, a decade ago.
So I think that because you need that development environment, well, not really a development environment, it's just your editor configured properly. It could be a barrier to entry, but I don't think it is anymore because the guys from Overtone released Emacs Live, which is clone this repository, start Emacs, and you're done. And it's set up for Clojure. It's got really nice documentation on how to use Emacs, what shortcuts to use, how to use the REPL, how to do interactive development, and it's literally just clone this, start using it.
Would you be willing to see if you can find a URL for that and paste it into the channel there, Andre?
My take on it is that you get drawn to these a bit more powerful environment because they enable things that you can't do with other languages. But if you want to keep the attitude, and that's how I started, of just writing stuff in Vim and testing with the REPL on the side, well, it works perfectly that way as well. I mean, even though it's yeah, you get an inferior experience from Emacs, but that doesn't mean you're yeah, disabled.
So generally, when I use multiple programming languages, I always learn something from one and bring it to the other. And I found the same experience with Emacs and Vim. So in Emacs, there's this one plugin which lets you jump to any place in the document just by hitting a shortcut and then the first letter of a word, and then it just highlights the words that contain that letter, and you can just jump there. And I had no idea about this way of like jumping around, and I found an alternative in Vim, and now I'm using it.
Well, that's fair enough. The editor wars are as old as editors themselves, and if Emacs at this particular point in time is best adapted for doing Clojure development, that may simply be because the people that were developing Clojure were doing it in Emacs. It's probably only a matter of time as the language and its tools and tooling and ecosystem become more popular that you'll see better support in Vim, better support in Sublime, better support in Atom, and so on and so forth. It's a matter of time, really. We have been dancing around thus far probably the most prominent example of Clojure in the ops world, and that is Riemann. Riemann is, if we're going to describe it conservatively, a tool in the monitoring space. It is analogous to the uninitiated to Nagios, but it is definitely not Nagios. I don't know if we have anybody here in the Hangops session who's got any experience with Riemann. I don't know. Maybe we'll just open it up, ask some questions. Would anybody like to talk about Riemann?
Oh, yeah, I guess I could open. Well, it's obviously a project I'm very excited about. I now account for a bit less than a fourth of the commits in the project, even though the huge amount of the work and the serious work has been done by a fair. It's a tool, yeah, that's initially directed at the monitoring space, but that can be used for it's basically just an event stream processor that lets you reason about events that come in the aggregator and take decisions based on this. Where it becomes very interesting is that it has the ability to work on event windows over time, and which allows you to analyze trends I recently published a small example on how you can analyze, for instance, Twitter trends with Riemann in a very easy way. It's you get to do things with your monitoring environment that are either really complex to do with tools like Nagios, or that you just couldn't do. Like, for instance, say that there's a surge of 404s on one of your web properties, and that's probably something you're interested in knowing, because something just, I mean, you probably have a wrong link, and these are things that are rather easy to do in Riemann. One of its downsides, again, is that the configuration file is actual Clojure code, so it can be a bit of a beast to approach for some people. But I fear with this suite of Riemann tools and myself in the collect-D world, I worked a lot to have emitters of events that already have a lot of interesting information, so you have to do as little transformations as possible once events come into Riemann. And I hope that, yeah.
So in that respect, Riemann is less a monitoring tool in the style of Nagios, where it goes out and it tries to see how much disk space is left, and then according to a particular, there's only 90% left, I better page somebody. Yeah, it's more like an event processing or a stream processing tool.
Yeah, it's fully passive in the sense that, like Riemann itself, what you get is an engine that starts, listen on a bunch of protocols. It knows how to speak the graphite carbon protocol. It has its own very efficient and fast protobuf-based protocol. And there's a few others that you can add on top of it. And that's all you get, right? An engine that listens on incoming events. And then you write a configuration that say, how do I deal with these events, right? At the heart of Riemann, there is an in-memory index, so it doesn't persist anything. That's not its primary role, and that primary index lets you store events for an amount of time that's defined by the TTL of incoming events, right? And that's what allows you to work on windows of events and take decisions. So basically, it's it listens on several inputs, take decisions, doesn't persist anything, but has a very fast in-memory index, and then there's a lot of possible outputs for once you've taken the decisions for your events, be it going out to Graphite, reaching out by mail or PagerDuty because you think there's something worth alerting for. And I mean, quite a few other. There's support for a few services like Librato and things like that.
When you say that it can make decisions, what does that mean? What sort of decisions?
Well, obviously the basic decisions based on metric values. If you need to attach state to a port, if you need to check for values within specific thresholds, which is one of the basic things that you want to do with a monitoring tool. Riemann's good at that, but one of the use cases I was saying is that, for instance, let's say, for instance, that you tell Riemann to keep a window of 5 minutes of events related to HTTP events. Of these, you split them by HTTP status code, and then you look at the rate of events. If the rate of 400 type status codes is elevated, it's above a certain percentage, then maybe you want to alert. That's the type of things that you're gonna do.
So how would you do alerting? Does Riemann do alerting itself, or does it plug into something like PagerDuty or?
Well, there's support for PagerDuty in Riemann itself. It has support for sending out mails, and that's about it. I mean, there's no complex like role-based when this you're meant to use PagerDuty to direct alert things. There's no complex mechanism within Riemann to handle that.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good approach. I wouldn't want Riemann to handle it itself. So as long as it integrates with something like PagerDuty or OpsGenie or something like that, then I think it achieves the goal.
And the beauty of the JVM is that you get a nice plugin mechanism that just appeared in the latest version. I implemented it's a simple Elasticsearch type plugin mechanism that you have, but if you need additional, like for instance, if you need Kafka support because you have you wire most of your events through Kafka, that comes in as a plugin. I've also bundled a few of common use cases as plugins as well. So if you had to take complex decisions on where events should end up when an alert is emitted, and you would want that to happen in Riemann, that's still possible, right?
From IRC, someone just wanted to mention that there's HipChat support as well. So if you are a HipChat user, that's already good to go. Oh, Andre's back. Good.
Wrong button.
Well, welcome back, Andre.
Hey.
Excellent. Well, Riemann I would say is probably sort of the gem, if you will, of the Clojure world from an operational perspective. It's the one that's got the largest ecosystem, the one that's had probably the largest deployment, again, as an operational tool, written in Clojure. From what how you were describing it, it sounds like it's kind of getting back to basics, which is where a certain amount of functionality, and that functionality is definitely useful, but only a certain amount of functionality is proposed. Because this is what this tool does. It does these things, and these things are related to each other, and we're not trying to do anything else. If you need to do other things, find another way to do them. Is this simply because that's how Riemann is meant to be designed, or is this representative, perhaps, of a greater philosophical approach in the Clojure world?
If you don't mind me trying to answer that, I do suspect that partly is because of this notion in the functional programming paradigm that you should just write really simple functions that do one thing only, and do them very well. And they're, of course, generic enough and so on, but I do suspect that part of the simplicity stems from the... of course, Clojure is a functional programming language, but I'll stop there. I don't know.
Yeah, so we were touching on this when we were talking about Palette, and we asked the same question: is Palette a framework that you build upon because that's its design philosophy, or because it's written in a functional programming language, probably by functional programmers? So I'm sure that Kyle tried to keep Riemann good at what it does and simple, but it might be as well an influence of it being written in a functional programming language.
Yeah, one of the tenets of how functional programming works is that you tend to have side effects happen at the beginning. So side effects is anything that touches the world, right? You tend to have them happen at the beginning to gather input, hand them off to a pure function, so something that's based on a certain input will always yield the same output, and then produce side effects with the output. And Riemann follows that philosophy as much as possible.
It's interesting that I'll try not to answer this question by asking the question. You said that a side effect is anything that interacts with the outside world. Could you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah. There's what are called pure functional programming languages, and Haskell is an example. Is programming where a function is defined in the mathematical way of defining functions. It's f of x yields y, and for any x, for the same value of x, it's always y that's going to be yielded, right? When you define functions this way, nothing is supposed to happen except yielding y when you call f of x, right? And writing pure functions is writing functions that adhere to this principle. So, for instance, logging something that happened, or reaching out over a socket, or accepting an event over a socket is obviously not pure, because you're not always going to get the same output, right? And and so one of the ways of building functional programs is to have these side effects. So accepting data over a socket, or logging stuff at the beginning, hand them to pure functions, which make them very easily testable. These pure functions, since you can give the whole domain of input that are possible and verify that you get the whole domain of output that you're supposed to get, and then hand them off to side effects, which allows you to build very simple network input blocks, and then network output blocks, or PagerDuty output blocks, or whatever, and then focus on writing these stream handling functions, which work on normalized data. I hope that wasn't confusing.
No, it makes sense. It seems then that in answering that question, we've actually sort of gotten to the core of our previous debate about whether this sort of idea of simplicity, doing one thing well, so on and so forth, is a philosophical question, or if it's just a side effect, if you will, of programming in a functional language. And actually, it seems to be kind of a little bit of both. That the philosophy is encouraged because of the nature of the language, which encourages the philosophy, which encourages the nature of the language, and so on and so forth. There's a reciprocal relationship there. And then that's going to extend to things that are, hopefully that extends to things that are built in the language. Depends who's writing it, I guess.
Yeah. As always.
As always, exactly. Ooh, I had a talking point and it just fell out of my head. Crap. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, one thing that I'll say about Riemann is that people tend to always go to Nagios as a monitoring solution because it's safe, right? It's like the Cisco of the monitoring wall. You're not going to get fired because you chose Nagios, even though you hate it. And switching to Riemann felt a bit scary at first when I elected to use it. But one thing I'll say is that I would never look back now, right? The simplicity and the flexibility that, especially since it's a passive monitoring engine, which make it very suitable for workloads where you have high node volatility, where nodes come on and off of your system. It makes it very easy to reason about classes of machines versus I need this machine to have a DB function and then look at what's happening there. I think it's a very efficient solution, and you won't be missing much by switching to it. So I'd encourage people to look into it as much as possible. And one thing that's worth knowing is that even though it's a relatively new tool, you're not alone if you choose to go with Riemann. There are starting to be several big companies relying on it for monitoring.
Are there particular resources of note that one, especially from an ops perspective, so we're talking less now as someone who's interested in pure programming because they're pure programmers, but for someone coming from the ops world who is used to Perl, Ruby, Python, shell scripting, etc., are there particular resources that we should be looking at, one, to get familiar with Riemann, and two, by extension, to get familiar with Clojure?
I think the only thing that you need is trying to get comfortable with Clojure since the configuration is in Clojure. I'll say that the configuration relies a lot on advanced concepts in Clojure. There's a lot of closures, not with a J, but with an S, in the functions that are exposed in the Riemann API, which makes it a bit hard at first to reason about. There's a lot of higher order programming involved. So maybe not a solid understanding, but an understanding of the basic concepts that in Clojure is interesting. After wrote a series of posts called Clojure 101, I think. So that's a good series. There are a lot of books that are good to get started with Clojure as well. Clojure programming being one of them, the O'Reilly book. And I would recommend looking into those.
Yeah, Clojure in action is really good, and I think another quite good way of getting started while you're just learning the basics is the Clojure cones. It's similar to like the Ruby cones and everything else, and so just doing the cones is not going to be really simple. But if you're following a book and doing the cones at the same time, I think you'll get quite far with them.
I would say that it's rather easy for Ruby programmers to get into Clojure. There are concepts that you touch on in the Ruby world that are much more prevalent in Clojure, but that you're going to be comfortable with. Maybe it's a bit harder for Python programmers because Python maybe encourages a bit more an imperative style, which you won't get in Clojure. So for people just used to the Unix shell, there are a few things in Clojure that are fun to work with, especially the threading macro, which resembles a piped series of actions on the shell, so that at least there's a bit of comfort there.
I'd like to pop everything to sed and then cut. That's what I want to do. Can I do that?
I'm not sure I understood what you said.
I want to pipe everything to awk and then to cut.
Okay.
Can I do regexes in Clojure?
Of course.
Good.
Well, people tend to be very scared of Lisp because of all the parentheses, right? But one of the things that Clojure got right, especially when compared to Common Lisp, for instance, is that there are a lot of what's called reader literals. So forms in the Lisp that allow easy access to things that you're used to work with. For instance, regexes have their reader literal, which means that you can write a regex in a certain way. So it's not // like in Ruby. It's a pound sign and quotes. But you also have reader literals for maps, for vectors, just like you have in Ruby and Python for sets. And they're called symbols in Ruby, but you also have they're called keywords in Clojure, but you also have these easy names to use as map keys. So you don't get completely drawn out in parentheses as you would in Scheme or other Lisps.
Which is to say that some concessions are the wrong word, but at least some consideration was made to the actual use cases for what people might be trying to do with Clojure as a language.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, it was built by people. Rich Hickey did a lot of work in C++, then Java, especially focused on parallelism and concurrency. And what it feels like when you start using it is that someone like took all the complex use cases revolving around mutable state, concurrency, and parallelism, and gave you simple tools to ensure you get things right. That's how it felt for me.
That's good to know, and I think encouraging for anybody in the ops world that is thinking of experimenting, if they're Clojure curious, to know that there are some, if not shortcuts, at least elements within the language that may not be completely alien. That's a good thing. And as you said, coming from the Ruby world, there's going to be some concepts in there which translate to a greater or lesser degree, and more ops people are familiar with Ruby, so that's also encouraging. We're coming up on the top of the hour, which is traditionally where we open up the floor if anybody has anything they'd like to say, talk about, etc. Pierre-Yves, if I may, you have a presentation or workshop coming up around
tomorrow.
the .scale conference.
Yeah.
Would you like to plug that briefly?
Yeah. Tomorrow we're gonna. .scale is a conference that we're the platinum sponsor of with Exascale, and that's happening on Monday in Paris. I hope to see many of you there. And this Saturday we're hosting a free workshop on visibility, which is a sort of a hobby of mine. In the infracode world, where we'll demo setting up a small web app, plug in collect have it emit to Riemann, work a bit with Riemann events, and then track that data into a Graph-it compatible tool that's called Cyanit, and display stuff with Grafana. So, and all this will be published as a Vagrant list of a Vagrant multi-box configuration. So yeah, if you're around Paris, you should drop by. I'll push the link to the. One other thing that I'll plug is that if you're too scared of deploying mcollective because it relies on RabbitMQ, I'd encourage you to look into another infracode tool written in Clojure that's called Fleet, that I published the link to on IRC. It misses some. It's missing screenshots because it's looking rather pretty now. And basically what it allows you to do is write scenarios for things that you'd like to happen in production, and execute those scenarios and look at the output, either from the command line from IRC through it has a UBot support, or from a web interface. So it's basically a bit like mcollective and rundeck mishmash together. It's got a controller written in Clojure and a small agent that you run on machines that's written in a Haskell. So it gives you like a standalone executable. It's pretty cool.
That's exactly the sort of stuff that we're looking for in the ops world. So again, good to see that there's evolution in terms of the toolbox. Thank you, Andre. Anything?
I'm good.
No, I have nothing to add to this discourse.
I've got nothing to plug, but yeah, really enjoy doing Hangops. So plugging that.
Very good. Okay, well, as always, thank you guys. I really appreciate you making some time to come through and to chat about this, Pierre. I know you're a busy guy. You've got stuff going on this weekend. I planned to come to the thing tomorrow, given that I live a metro ride away from where it's happening, but instead I'm going to London, so I will be missing .scale entirely. Wah, wah. These things can't be avoided. From my perspective, I guess I don't have anything to plug at this time except Hangops itself. If you guys enjoy the format, if you like the things that we talk about, be sure to tell your friends, be sure to tell your boss. If you're a boss, encourage your employees to join the session. Always some interesting stuff, interesting conversations. Once again, thank you, Pierre and Andre, for coming through. For everybody on YouTube, people hanging out in the channel, sending us questions, appreciate that. And on behalf of the entire Hangops crew, thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, cheers.
Yeah, see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.